Liz, recording. Thank you very much. Hey everyone, thanks for joining today's Resource Exchange. This is our third and our most marquee guest that we've had. So the first two must have gone well enough that we can bring on someone of the caliber of Shayne Kavanagh. Shayne, thank you so much for being a part of our program here. We've had the opportunity to interview people we've worked with and ask some general questions, interview style. And it's just been really great for information exchange in a time when it's not easy for everybody to get together and develop this sense of community. So really appreciate this opportunity. And for those of you who don't know, man, Shayne, I was even trying to think back to, I think the first time we met in person was Fort Lauderdale at GFOA's annual conference, which must have been in approximately 2008. So 2008, 2009, over 10 years ago. And I've just completely enjoyed our friendship and the work that we've been able to do together. So this is wonderful, just such a fun opportunity.
Oh, thank you for having me, and I appreciate the nice introduction, but I'll be honest, for your quote-unquote marquee guest, I have just realizing I have just forgotten to turn my cell phone off, so I'm going to grab that so it doesn't ring during our presentation, because that would be embarrassing. So, second.
Sounds great. Well, Shayne, we have a few kind of getting to know you questions. And the first, I know oftentimes when we get together, we've had tremendous conversations over the years about what you're into reading wise. And, on my desk, I'll just share, I've got 3 books. One is Financing the Future, which is really good. I've got Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities, excellent read. These are both by the same author, and I bought a second copy of Financing the Future. If you don't know this author, his name is Shayne Kavanagh, everybody. But what's that? Hey, Matt.
There you go.
All right. Pretty cool. Well, what is your current book recommendation?
All right. Yeah.
What's your current
recommendations, Chris? Let me do a little background here for you guys. I don't know if folks have heard of something called McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y of management. Chris, have you heard of that by any chance? Yeah, all right, so Chris knows what this is. So Theory X and Theory Y, for those of you that don't know, it's a bit old school, but it's a good one. Theory X is essentially that people are, essentially looking to not do work and need to be motivated, or kind of, it's like a dim view of humanity, right? And Theory Y is a positive view of humanity, where we just need to put the systems in place for people to do their best. And I'm generally a Theory Y kind of individual, if you're familiar with my work. And so I've been reading a book recently called How to Think Like a Rocket Scientist. And I think, Chris, there's a lot of good relationships to kind of, I think your work at ResourceX takes some of its inspiration from SpaceX, if I'm not mistaken. And this book is all about how to apply the thinking of a rocket science to life, and particularly moonshot sort of endeavors. So if you're trying to accomplish something big and audacious in your life, thinking like a rocket scientist can help you do that. And this book has been really quite interesting in guiding some of our work at GFOA, because we have a couple projects now that I think can only be described as moonshots. So having this guidance is a good thing. And then kind of going back to why I brought up Theory X and Theory Y, right? I think both these things are theories, right? So not one or the other is completely true. So as someone who tends to Theory Y, I find myself attracted to that. And it's also important to realize Theory X exists and one needs to be aware of it. And so another book I read recently is called The 48 Laws of Power. And if you're familiar with Machiavelli, this is like a modern day Machiavelli. And this probably tells you all I need to know right here. This is the #1 requested book in prison libraries. So this book is, yeah, exactly. All very much about just kind of raw power politics and how it works, and like how to recognize patterns, and very, I think enlightening, and a very good complement, if you will, to like the theory why sort of stuff that I'm normally into.
Man, that's awesome. I'm gravitating towards thinking like a rocket scientist for just a moment. Is this a style of thinking that you're dabbling in at GFOA? Just kind of curious of what has inspired you or made this book of interest to you these days.
Yeah, sure. So we have two projects at GFOA happening right now where I think this is particularly applicable. One is called Rethinking Budgeting for 2020 and Beyond. And the goal of that project is to take a step back from how budgeting is normally done and think about what we might do differently. So if you like think about what our budgeting innovations are nowadays, right? We think of something like, zero-based budgeting, right? That's a thing people do. That's been around since the 1970s. Priority budgeting, which is the great work you've done, but that was invented, I think, at essentially the turn of the century, right? With budgeting for outcomes. And so the kind of question is, like, as the profession, what might be the next thing, right? Because there's a reason why traditional budgeting has existed forever, right? We found an article by Aaron Wildowski, who is, like, if you're not familiar with the academic work, he's like the big name in academic research and budgeting. He wrote this article in 1970 called "A Budget for All Seasons: Why the Incremental Budget Lasts." And all his complaints about incremental budgeting in 1970 are literally all exactly the same things we're talking about today. And he gives the reasons in his paper why it exists, and those reasons are still quite valid today. So we're trying to think about, well, what is different in the year 2020 that makes us think that we might be able to take things in a different direction. So even we believe that the conditions do exist to go in a different direction, and those include things like the technology is different today. We understand a lot more about human behavior and how people make decisions, including the fact that people are predictably irrational. I think back in the 1970s, folks assumed rationality, right? We assumed the rational economic actor. We've, I think, gotten past that in a lot of ways in current psychology. And then also, I think last but certainly not least is, I think, the kind of social zeitgeist has changed, right? Where we have got, income inequalities, for example, that are at record highs, and people are more aware of racial inequalities. Where back in the 1970s, those issues were not at the forefront, and so perhaps looking at ways of budgeting that weren't cognizant of those problems was okay. Whereas today, I think folks are looking for different types of answers.
That's great. Well, thank you for those recommendations. I have seen a number of articles recently that are focused on longer term thinking, and we will get to long-term financial planning here in just a moment, but that's always been something that is you brought to the table, Shayne, and how to zoom out and really think bigger picture. So I don't have either of those books, so thank you for the recommendation. That's
very welcome.
Second getting to know you question, Shayne. I mean, I remember being in Seattle, walking blocks and blocks to try to find not just a sushi restaurant, but like the best in Seattle. And for anybody who doesn't know, if you ever need to know a really cool place to go find something to eat and experience the city when we can travel again, contact Shayne. And so, Shayne, I was going to ask you, what is your favorite meal to order at a restaurant or to order out?
All right. Well, the answer to that is anything at Hop Alley. And Hop Alley is, to Chris's point, I'm a researcher. I research things I can't help myself, and restaurants are things that get researched. And Hop Alley is the best Chinese restaurant in the country. And I discovered this with Chris, actually, on one of my visits to Denver. So if you ever find yourself in Denver, do check this place out. It is amazing. Can't recommend enough. It's I've had the opportunity to go to China a couple times, and the food at this restaurant is the only thing in the States I've found that is really comparable to the level of like authenticity and quality you would get in China. So really interesting, good stuff.
To the point where you walked back when we were there the first time, started to talk to the people running the restaurant and come to understand the types of dishes that you had in China. It was a memory I'll never forget. So it was just tremendous. Shayne, do you have a quote that inspires you in your work, in your life?
Yes, it is by a Greek warrior poet who was, I mean, Archelaus, if I remember. I don't speak Greek too well, so I may be butchering his name, and I apologize to him if I am. But it goes like this: we do not rise to the level of our expectations; we fall back to the level of our training. So, in other words, put in the work, because you're not going to perform up to what you hope. You don't rise to the situation. You kind of, the training you have depends or will determine how you perform. So put the training in and put the work in ahead of time, and you'll be prepared.
Amazing. Wow, that's going to be one that's going to sink in for a little while. Fourth question, what is it about working in the public sector that particularly inspires you?
Oh, well, that's an easy one. It is the people that I work with. So the best part of my day is talking to the members and other folks in local government who are doing this work on the in the cities every single day. So I used to be a city manager, or assistant city manager, I should say, and the opportunity to work at GFOA and help other folks in public management do their jobs is very attractive to me, and so it was quite rewarding to work with the folks who are in cities, counties, school districts, special districts, and all their local governments that are part of the GFOA universe.
It's true, and looking at the audience members here today, these are people who have, I mean, they're special in our community, and likewise within GFOA, it is just a different type of personality that gets attracted to this mission. It's not easy. And that's somehow related to your last quote as well.
Yeah, well, it's folks who really want to help out the communities where they live, which is a very noble calling in my view.
And maybe that's a segue to, how is it, you mentioned being assistant city manager, how is it that you got to GFOA? Can you talk through your past?
No, yeah, sure. So I guess started way back in high school, where I was interested in history, and I said, well, I'm going to go to school for history, right? And Northern Illinois in Illinois was known for being a history school. So I went there, figured out pretty quickly that history is about dead people, and they don't have a lot of money. So growing up from a very practical family in the suburbs of Chicago, like, well, wait, how do you get a job in that field? And like, that sounds like it could be a challenge when you figure out what's going on. And so political science sounds more dynamic, like, that sounds like something I should do. Went into that and started studying international relations at Northern Illinois. I then realized Northern Illinois is the furthest point from a foreign border in the United States. Maybe not literally, but it feels like it. So certainly, maybe is this the best place to study international relations? Turns out, if you are from Illinois, it will not be a surprise to you, but if you are not, this may be interesting, is that Illinois has one of the largest, if not the largest, number of local governments in the country. So it is an amazing place to study local governments because you have a veritable laboratory right in your own backyard. And so Northern Illinois has a fantastic program for this. So I found myself in public administration, right, which is like the practical version of political science, and coming from a practical family, like, this sounds great, So got into that, went to eventually work at the Village of Palos Park, which is in the south suburbs of Chicago, as the assistant city manager there, was doing my PhD program part-time. And in essence, GFOA said, well, why don't you come work for us? And I always did want to work in sort of like a research role. So it seemed like a really good fit, and here I am. I was a member of GFOA, actually, which at the time, that's how I found out about GFOA, because I saw it in the newsletter that they were looking for research people. So keep your eye on that GFOA newsletter. You never know what you'll see.
Specifically, within, you've been at GFOA for a bit. Has your role evolved over that period of time? I mean, you've been, research has always seemed to be at its core what you're so fascinated with, what you're great at, getting the bigger picture story. But over the course of time you've been at GFOA, how has it changed?
Yeah, well, I think, we've continued to evolve, and that's what I'm looking for. Like, I think deepen and have a more nuanced view of finance, right? Because, the finance certainly the adding up numbers and all that stuff is very important, right? But we've been talking about in more recent years is like role of things like trust and open communication, treating people fairly, like the soft side. Whereas if you don't get that down, like the technical side will have a very hard time succeeding, right? So I would say that's probably the main point of evolution I've seen over my time there.
Incredible. I was jotting down some notes as you were talking about your studies in history, the number of local governments in Illinois, and therefore why it could be a really fascinating place to study. Have you been following at all the launch? You mentioned how to think like a rocket scientist and SpaceX earlier. There's been a SpaceX satellite internet arm of the company that launched something called Starlink recently. And I encourage you to check this out. It might be available. In their terms and conditions for using Starlink, there are some bylaws for, you have to extrapolate this out, but that they're planning on having this internet service available for the first cities on the moon and the first cities on Mars. And they're declaring that the way that these cities will be formed will be brand new. So Shayne, I'm formally putting you on notice that you might be a contributor to writing the first city charter for a moon base or a Mars colony, which would be advantageous for all of us.
Oh yeah, that would be great. There's some long-term thinking there, so I applaud SpaceX. Thinking that internet for the moon.
Awesome. Back to Earth, back to GFOA, the home base. Would love to hear you talk about GFOA's mission and in general, like the breadth of your work and the work that GFOA is doing.
Sure. Yeah. So GFOA has a very large breadth of things that we do. I think broadly speaking, our goal is to enable thriving communities by helping local governments improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of their financial management. So that is done through a lot of different technical offerings. Like we have a big training program, technical assistance program. So the folks here that maybe have an accounting background, I'm sure are doubtlessly familiar with like the Blue Book, for example. We have a federal liaison center that does relationships with the federal government to promote different legislation that helps out the local communities. And then the area where I work is research consulting. And so our job is to develop new and innovative approaches that are both practical and to help people apply those approaches and also contribute to the educational content that we develop. So different sort of books, of course, magazine articles, webinars, and other sorts of opportunities along those lines.
That's it. Completely great. Hey, on this note, I know a lot of the people who are tuned in today are either GFOA members or their organization is. We wanted to make sure, also knowing that some people had to run before the full hour is up, if anybody wanted to type in a question or come off mute and ask Shayne a question, we wanted to plug in 2 opportunities during today's interview to give you that chance. Did anybody have something they wanted to type in or come off mute and ask? Well, you got Shayne. We do have some general questions that have been entered in people's registration, so we'll go there certainly towards the end of the presentation overall. And I would just encourage everybody, if you do have some questions, feel free to use the chat box, and we'll make sure that we get to everybody before the end of the session. But that was just kind of a neat period here in the middle, talking about the mission of GFOA, and that it's a powerful mission. Would you mind repeating that, Shayne? I mean, it is something to sit back and think about.
Sure. Promote thriving communities, and doing that through the effectiveness and efficiency of local government finances. So local government finances are the method by which we support a thriving community. In fact, we called that book you showed up Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities. So no coincidence there that we see that of solid community finances is the basis for making a community that's a great place to live, work, and play for people.
It is very powerful what you're saying. At ResourceX, we find ourselves also most interested in the future of thriving communities, and we chose this angle of coming at it through resources, through sustainable finances, as the fuel in the engine, so to speak, or the lifeblood, or whatever metaphor you want to be able to use. But that's obviously why our work has intersected so often, is we find ourselves really thinking about that. Like, well, we need the resources to be able to marshal and direct toward the outcomes that you want for a thriving community overall. And that was, thank you for kind of going back into that for GFOA's mission.
Well, it's like it's the foundation, and if your foundation is shaky, right, it's going to be very hard to focus on anything else. Like, that's going to be like kind of looking forward into the future or aspirational if, you know, the ground under your feet is shifting around. So like, I think that's why these finances are so important.
I want to go into financial foundations. You just mentioned it, and this was a new, it's I believe it's your latest book, although there's still been a lot written article-wise throughout 2020 here. But can you go into the inspiration behind financial foundations and talk a little bit about it?
Sure. Yeah, the inspiration is something called the tragedy of the commons. And if you're not familiar with the tragedy of the commons, it goes like this. You have a grazing area, and that grazing area is owned by all of the farmers who surround it. So we'll call it farmer A, B, C, D. All of these farmers own the grazing area. And because they own it collectively, the individual interest of any farmer is to send their animals onto the grazing area as much as possible, because if that farmer doesn't, say that we're talking about farmer A, say farmer A does not send his or her animals, farmer B, C, and D are still going to send their animals. So all those animals will be grazing, getting fat and happy, while farmer A's animals are sitting at home doing nothing. So everyone's incentive is send the animals onto the grazing area as much as possible. And the result is that the grazing area gets overgrazed and becomes barren and useless, and hence the tragedy of the commons. And the premise of financial foundations is that the local government budget is very much like our grazing area, where it is collectively owned by all the different stakeholders, so different departments, different community groups. This is the public budget. By definition, everyone is a collective owner of the public budget, and they all have the same incentive: get yours, because if you don't, the next guy will. So everybody is trying to get their piece of the pie, and everyone's trying to draw from the budget. And after multiple years of this happening, the tragedy of the local government budget could ensue, right? So the local government budget becomes distressed, and things, we'll say, are not in good shape. And now the good news is that there is a Nobel Prize winning body of work about how to solve the tragedy of the commons. It's called Elinor Ostrom's Common Pool Resource Theory. So we translated Elinor Ostrom's work to public finance, and that's really kind of where the inspiration of all this comes from.
Is there an equally vivid shared farmland image that you can create for what the solution starts to look like?
Yeah, so we took Elinor Ostrom's work and really boiled it down into what we call the 5 pillars of financial foundations. So the first one is called establish a shared vision. And maybe what I'll do, Chris, is since I think maybe it was the catalyst for having me on here, was a recent project we did with the Washington, D.C. government. They have one of the, if not the leading capital program in the country. And we look at their lens through the framework of financial foundations, and lo and behold, their work aligns very well with financial foundations. So first element or first pillar is to establish a long-term vision, because the idea here is that having a long-term vision gives people a reason to cooperate, meaning in the traditional budget process, everyone's trying to get their piece of the pie. What we're saying is they need something to look forward to beyond this immediate interest, right? So everyone needs to have this shared goal. And Washington, D.C. developed this shared goal by through an experience with the school system. So in Washington, D.C., the school system is part of the municipal government. School buildings were crumbling. Everyone realized it's a big problem. And as they said, well, we need to fix this, they came to the realization that really the same problem of deferred asset maintenance applies to all other asset classes that DC has. And just like schools, if those asset classes aren't up to condition, it is going to be very difficult to create the sort of place that people want to live in Washington, D.C. So their shared vision was for a comprehensive program to maintaining all their assets at a condition that gives the people of DC what they need to thrive. That's pillar one. Pillar two is to build trust and open communication. And a couple things there is they built a system, a computerized data system to guide this that's been central to their efforts. And how they built trust with this is that the departments contribute the data to the system. So if the Public Works Department has data on their assets, that data is used to build the asset management system. So the Public Works Department can see their own records and their own kind of version of things reflected in the centralized system that builds trust in the approach. And another important part of building trust is to show good results. So in DC, they've got something like 3 bond rating upgrades recently. So getting a lot of positive feedback from the community and the rating agency community on their approach. So if you show results, you're going to build trust. Third pillar is collective decision making, so making decisions together. So DC has all the departments involved in the capital planning process. So it is not like a group that is disconnected from the operating departments. All departments are involved in decisions in a fair way. And they also go out to the community to get community input. And then pillar 4 is create clear rules. And with clear rules, what we're essentially saying is you need to kind of reinforce cooperative and constructive behavior. So in DC, they do this with like a positive and negative feedback loop. So if you are a department and you don't contribute data to the central asset management system, you are not going to get your budget approved. And of course, departments would rather have their budgets approved. So when they do contribute data about asset management to the central system, they will get their budget approved. So that is a very different feedback system from, say, an incremental budgeting system, which is, well, whatever you budget got last year, that's going to be what you're going to get next year, plus or minus some changes around the margins. They have changed that. So the rules are, if you contribute to the system, you get your budget requests are much better received than those that don't contribute to the system. So they put in place the rules in DC to reinforce this kind of behavior. And then lastly, but definitely not least, is to treat people fairly. So the idea here, if the system isn't fair, it's going to fall apart. And in DC, I mentioned earlier that they have one version of the truth in their asset management system. So the decisions are based on accurate information, which reinforces a sense of fairness. All the departments are involved in the asset management system, which is important. This might actually relate to one of the questions that was asked by the audience. Is that one of the questions was, well, how important is it to have consistency in the criteria for asset management? And in DC's case, they have very consistent criteria that are applied equally across all departments, and that is key to what they're doing. If one department were held to one set of criteria and another department were held to a different set of criteria, that would not be seen as a fair system. And that really kind of talks to the fairness of the procedure. And then as far as fairness of the outcomes, they use a portfolio planning approach in DC so that different asset classes are thought about in a kind of smart, balanced way. And what this does is it means that each department is going to get some resources. So it's not a case where, well, Department X gets all the resources every year, so I am not going to take the system seriously, or I'm going to withdraw my support from the system. This portfolio approach allows every department to get something for what they need to do for their mission, so people feel better about the outcome and also it's doing well for the community. And they also have a community-led view to make sure that each neighborhood is getting what it needs to thrive. So there's a good equitable distribution between the different portions of Washington, D.C. as well.
That's pretty vivid. And thanks for going through the pillars as well. I was imagining the grazing land, and with that system, the goal is not to overgraze and ruin your resource base. And you've outlined a pretty clear approach for how that might happen. I'm particularly intrigued, especially when we deal with times of stress, times of crisis, where our focus tends to narrow to getting through today, getting through next week. When you mentioned pillar one, in terms of the long-term vision, how do communities balance that, or always keep that in mind, and develop something that's very strong, that is very directional, even in the midst of near-term, short-term crisis? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, sure. So two things for that is, first of all, if you're like, well, that all sounds great, but to Chris's point, I've got problems right now here today. We have a resource for you called Fiscal First Aid. So that is GFOA.org/FFA, which is our 12-step process to financial recovery, invented back in 2008 in response to the Great Recession. Very well received resource, super comprehensive. And I would urge you to check that out and we totally revised and updated for 2020. So it is 100% refreshed. So this is not 2008 material. This is 2020 material. So check that out if you need some help there. And to answer your question directly, Chris, is give you an example from DC. So they, of course, had many of the same problems everyone else did. They had to deal with a 13% cut in their budget, which is a lot, obviously, for their capital planning. So well, how do we allocate our capital planning resources in light of this pretty severe budget cut? So they looked at their long-term vision and said, what is it? Our vision is to have a thriving community and to keep our asset classes up to condition as best as we can. So they identify what are our core assets? How do we make sure we keep those up to class? What are the critical capital projects that we need to keep this community a thriving place? How do we keep those on track? And when you're talking about, what's core and non-core, that gives you the opportunity to say, well, the things that are non-core, that's what we can potentially sacrifice, which is, I think, in stark contrast to the more traditional approach of across the board cuts and things like this, where it's more of a thin the soup type of thing, where you cut everything equally. And, though that seems fair, it's not really fair, because you're essentially not doing your best to make the community all it can be, because you're cutting things that are important equally with things that are not so important.
It's so important what you're talking about. We had John Dance was 2 sessions ago talking about capital budgeting and capital planning, and in the midst of the COVID recovery, in some respects the planning for whatever scenario is going to materialize next, we are hearing about many communities who have tried to put a pause on their capital budgets entirely as a near-term source of resources to just get by. And I think it's particularly great news or great perspective that you're offering, that you have to still keep that long-term vision intact, like the bigger picture of what you're going for. Even if you have a 13% budget cut, as you're describing, how do you prioritize those scarce resources within? And you need that long-term vision to guide that decision-making.
Yeah, it all comes down to that. And it goes back to the long-term vision DC came from the mayor, right? So the mayor's initial vision was, and it came from the schools, which I think is another good point, is that this was something that was very visceral to people, right? Like, schools are very easy to identify with, right? Compared to sewer pipes. Like, sewer pipes are in the ground. They're frankly out of sight, out of mind. People don't like thinking about them. School buildings, like, people like to think about school buildings, and that was used as the jumping off point for a more comprehensive view. So, kind of to the lesson there from DC is it was motivated by top leadership, and it used kind of an incremental sort of approach, which works very well in government. They didn't go from 0 to 60. And they went from, well, we're gonna start with schools. And I think they also talked about the other, like a couple other like key asset classes. And then they expanded it gradually from there. So also kind of keeping a kind of realistic pace of change in government often works out well, and it did for DC.
That's really good too, and kind of a segue of not going from 0 to 60 and a realistic pace of change. What would you consider to be the most immediate action you would recommend to local governments with respect to capital budgeting?
Yeah, it's a good question. What I was just talking about is the kind of identify asset classes that will get the most interest from people. And also kind of maybe another concept is the coalition of the willing. In DC, they made sure that the folks who were the owners of those asset classes, like meaning the schools and the other owners of other asset classes they identified, were eager to help them build the system. So they got the folks who were going to be supportive, would provide their data, the necessary data, and otherwise be willing players in developing this comprehensive approach to asset management. So I think those first steps are find the coalition of the willing, find your allies, and find a limited area to start with that is inspiring enough to get people on board.
Awesome. I like it. We're kind of bouncing from long-term vision to near-term, what can you get done that would be particularly high of value. And now I'm going to bounce back to the long-term. We did have a write-in question, Shayne, and thinking about long-term financial planning, the nature of the question was about what is the right time horizon? They listed 10, 20, 30 years, more. I love that there's more. Yeah, think big. But in your experience, how has time horizon played into it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, I think we can all in this field give ourselves a pat on the back that this question is being asked, right? Because I will tell you, like when, maybe however long ago I started GFOA, like this was not the question people would think about. It was like, well, if we're going to look like 2 years ahead with a biennial budget, that's crazy. And now we have a question that, is 20 years long enough? Which I think is great progress. So go team. Now to answer the question directly, couple different answers to that. I think it depends on your circumstances a bit. So I'll give you a story. A city we were working with had, because it's standard, you hear this a lot, is like the 5-year plan. Like this is something that I'm sure everyone's heard. And in this city, they had a big source of revenue that was scheduled to sunset in 6 years. And it would have been like 33% of their revenue. So you tell me, what value would a 5-year plan have when everybody is worried about the revenue that's going to sunset in 6 years? That's what people are concerned about, right? It would probably not have a lot of value. So you have to think about, all right, well, what issue is driving planning? Why are we doing this? And what time horizon will resonate with people and help us solve our problem? Another example of Baltimore, where Baltimore was worried about some fairly big issues in terms of like urban planning and demographics, like, having like folks who are leaving the city and such and trying to attract young families and whatnot. That's not going to happen overnight. So they took a 10-year perspective, right? So the perspective needs to be driven by what your issues are and what's going to resonate with people who are the audience for this plan and participants in the planning process. And then, maybe the last couple points is I think it can vary for capital versus operating, because capital tends to have a longer term time horizon. So, maybe your capital plan is 20 years and maybe your operating plan is like 5, whatever. But the point being is you can vary it according to the appropriateness of the topic, so that's similar to subject matter, but a little nuanced. And then maybe the last point on that, is I've seen some cities do this, which I think is an interesting practice, is they'll have like a 5-year forecast or whatever that they try to make reasonably accurate. And then they do like a 20-year trending forecast where people are like, well, we're not like pretending this is accurate. This is just to say, if the current trends kept going as they're going, where would we end up? And they have found those enlightening in terms of just extrapolating out where things would go in the future. But I think the takeaway there is they have a line that delineates like, well, this is something where we're saying this is our best guess and we actually are trying to plan to this. And this is just more exploratory and making us aware of where things could go in the future. So it kind of, I think, takes some of the pressure off the long-term forecast, the very long-term forecast, to reframe it as more exploratory and less predictive.
Along these lines, you've seen capital plans, Shayne, I mean, in the time horizon that you've discussed, where if it's an asset management plan, we can talk about the life cycle of a facility and begin to plan for concrete projects that are related, or an infrastructure project and your sewer pipe replacement. And it tends to be more easy to imagine. It's like, here's our programmed in list of capital projects that are high on everybody's needs list. Have you ever seen anything similar on the operating side in terms of a 5-year list of new programs that need to start, a 5-year list of programs you're planning to sunset and reallocate resources, a 5-year list of programs where 5 years from now they're going to need to double in capacity from a service level perspective? Along those lines, in your work at GFOA, have you come across something analogous on the operating side?
Sure, and I'd like to maybe weave in a comment that was just made about kind of the idea of a bright line, meaning in the chatting, a comment about like a line between your shorter terms and your longer term forecasts and all that. And so I think a practice that's potentially useful here is scenario planning. I know maybe the audience here has heard Chris talk about this before, but I think it's a good tool, right? Because if you want to explore different possibilities, because I have seen what you're talking about, Chris, where people will develop different scenarios to say, well, here is one possible scenario of the way things could go in terms of revenues and expenditures. Here's another possible scenario. And because if you're going to do that, right, if you have one version of the future, people become fixated on that one version of the future. And that can be not good, and for probably reasons that don't need explaining to this group. But having multiple versions of the future to say that, you know what, it could go lots of different ways. Here are some of them, and let's see what we can develop as a group to be resilient and have the best outcome no matter which of these revenue scenarios unfolds in the future.
Very cool. That's helpful. And I love the focus on long-term planning, the vision, how to get tactical and build out your plans. That's been really helpful. Thanks for your clarity. We did have another question that came in. I think it's related, but talking about capital versus operating and prioritizing. Have you found it effective to have a singular prioritization process for everything at the same time, capital projects and operating, or is it more helpful or useful in your experience to see those planning exercises take place separately?
Yeah, so I love the question, because the question is really about consistency, which is very key if you're trying to build trust, right? If your process, because you think about your audience, right? The audience for finance, like finance is not the thing that they think about every day, right? Like your audience is the operating departments. They're trying to think about, how do I get the job done? And finances is a way to get that done. And so if the process changes too much, right, from year to year, I think it can be disorienting and at worst, potentially trust reducing. So to the extent that you can make the process consistent, that is a good thing. So I think the main avenue of consistency is between departments. That's the thing to be most mindful of, is Department A treated consistently with Department B, right? So if you have a capital planning process and Department A has different criteria than Department B for deciding what gets budgeted, that would be a problem potentially. And DC, for instance, is very mindful about having consistent criteria across all of their departments for that. And I think the question is between operating and capital. So I think it would be less important that there's consistency between capital and operating, but more important that there's consistency between the departments within capital and within operating. So you could have different criteria, because you know what, and you might want to say, like, what is the full life cycle cost of this investment for a capital asset? To me, that would be a very important criteria you'd want to think about. That would not be as important, right, in the area of the operating, where these are variable costs essentially from year to year. So you wouldn't say, well, what's the life cycle cost of hiring 3 police officers, right? Because you could have 2 police officers next year, right? And certainly there's pensions and other long-term costs you'd want to take into consideration, but it's just not the same question. So I think would be perfectly fine to have different criteria between operating capital. Just again, go for consistency between departments within those areas.
And I like it. It seems to relate back to your pillar, at least in part, on clear rules. It's clear rules applied consistently. That fits right in with financial foundations. Awesome. I am offering some of these questions that did come directly from the audience. So, Christine, thanks for your follow-up comment that you got what you were hoping for from that question. And if anybody else either has an additional question or wanted to elaborate further on how I was portraying the question or Shayne's answer, please jump in the chat or come off of mute. Shayne, another one that we had was, what is your number 1 policy recommendation for a municipality?
Sure. So at the risk, and I can see the sun has started, so apologize for the weird washed out picture. Aura. Yeah, I'm probably guessing most people are listening to this and not watching it. So if you're not watching it, you're good. But anyways, at the risk of giving what sounds like a circular answer, my number 1 recommendation for policy is policies, being financial policies. So in other words, like, what is your reserve policy? What is your local debt limit? What is your policy with respect to use of one-time revenues? Again and again and again, we find that these are super, super important in local governments. And just to tie it back to financial foundations, let's say you have a set of financial policies that describe what is your target level of reserves, what is the maximum amount of debt that you as a community are willing to take on, how are you going to use one-time revenues or limit the use of one-time revenues. That creates, number 1, a vision, right? So you have a common vision amongst people for the financial future and what describes a healthy financial future, right? You have trust and open communication, because that is definitely open communication when those policies are written down and people can access them. You use collective decision-making to develop those policies, and those policies are the very definition of clear rules, right? And if you apply those policies equally to everybody, that's fair treatment. So you basically hit all 5 pillars by developing those policies. So I would say take a look at what GFOA considers to be the core policies. And if you're interested in doing that, we have something called the Financial Policy Challenge, which is basically a challenge to adopt the key policies that GFOA recommends. You submit them and you will be recognized.
That's very cool. We'll make sure in our follow-up to audience member Shayne, we'll include some of the literature, certainly the books, Cash is King, and the Financial Policy Challenge would be a great one to add there as well. And for any of the ResourceX community, most of the work that you're doing would lend itself, at least in part, to many of the criteria for the Financial Policy Challenge. There are many intersections, I'll simply say, which is very cool. Shayne, a couple more. We had, going back to asset management, one question was around what are the public-private opportunities that you're seeing in asset management for local government?
All right, cool. Good question. So when I asked about screen sharing before, I had seen this question, and this will be a fun question. So maybe some of you have heard of the Gartner Hype Cycle. By any chance, if you have not heard of the Gartner Hype Cycle, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick just so you can see it. It's a good time. Let's see. So Chris, I am hoping you are looking at the Hype Cycle right now.
Yeah, I was on mute. Yeah, it's on the screen. Perfect.
Awesome. All right. So basically the Hype Cycle is fairly simple. So if you're not seeing the audio right now, I will explain it to you, and I think you'll get the idea pretty easily. Essentially, what it's saying is any new technology or new idea goes through this cycle where it gets a lot of hype first, and then it kind of builds this unsustainable or unrealistic peak, what they call the peak of inflated expectations. it then suffers a drop off all the way down to what they call the trough of disillusionment. And then as people realize, well, it's not going to save the world, but it's not the worst thing either. People realize what's useful about it, and it settles into the plateau of productivity. And why I'm bringing up the hype cycle is this question reminded me of P3s, right? Because like a number of years ago, I think you could trace P3s along the hype cycle, where, you know what, it was going to be like change the world, and like we were going to have like all this like new asset. You hear like some very hyperbolic things thrown about when it comes to P3s. And I think, you know, people, that's cooled off, shall we say, a bit. I did not hear that talk anymore at all. And, you know, that would be the trial of disillusionment. And I would propose to the group that we will probably get to the plateau of productivity with that, where we will end up with, we'll say, a better sense as an industry as what the proper role of P3s are right now. I'm going to stop screen sharing because I think that made the point. But I think kind of then the takeaway for that, the question is, there's probably not a like firm, like well-defined role for what public-private partnerships can bring to the table for local government as of yet. It is probably is not kind of the hype that was a few years ago, but it's probably not as bad as like, you know, maybe, you know, it might seem in like the kind of trial of disillusionment. And then the other thing I might go back to is it goes back to the vision. So we did some pretty interesting work very recently about community visions and how those can be used to invite other sectors into your process, meaning your planning process. So inviting like other public organizations, private organizations, which I think is the nature of this question, is inviting them to get invested in public goals, right? So if you have a clear vision, it's going to be a lot easier for private sector organizations to say, hey, I want to get involved in that. And that is something I would be willing to contribute resources to. And we've got a number of case studies of cities that have done just that, where they have had some very good luck in bringing in like philanthropy and other private sector investment into public goals by the process of creating a shared vision for the entire community.
That is awesome. And just really exciting. Again, this intersects with part of our own long-term vision, seeing where we work with Kalamazoo, Michigan, and it's a fine example of private sector becoming invested into shared mission with the public sector. Thanks for hypothesizing that we're out of the trough of disillusion. That's great. And I wanted to raise that in financial foundations is really cool. Shayne, we followed your articulation of the idea of network enterprises strongly. And Brad Steckert's on the call. Brad comes from Washington County, Wisconsin, and some of their storyline is in the book. Eric Keck from Englewood, Colorado. Seeing how these partnerships take place, you've inspired us. We've tried to share those lessons with the ResourceX community as they look at the programs they offer, and they invite private sector partners, nonprofit, other public sector partners, all partners to engage in a discussion of shared long-term vision and how their common resource base can provide a better foundation for all. So thanks for that inspiration.
Oh, you're welcome. And you reminded me, you know, as far as the list of resources afterwards, I will give you the link to the latest on network enterprises and all that. So we just completed a kind of new resource that gets into developing the vision and then inviting public, private, and nonprofit folks to be involved with that and contribute their time, energy, and resources to achieving that vision.
Extremely cool. I can't wait to see that. And that kind of leads into my last question. We'll offer one more opportunity for the crowd as well. Everything that you're talking about, Shayne, leads to this question. The question was, in your experience with ResourceX, what is the coolest programmatic action or behavior that you've observed? I'll leave it to you. I'll say that from my perspective, it is the network enterprise, the programmatic activity, but I would love to hear your take.
Yeah, that was actually my take as well. Yeah, exactly, right. No, I think it's good. I mean, because the program inventory by itself is super valuable, right? And GFOA talks about this all the time, that people should do this. And using it for thinking about, well, how can we work with other folks to achieve our goals is taking it to the next level. So I think that is very good stuff.
We have partnered. We're a living example, a living embodiment
exactly.
of partnering our own ideas for how to create a networked enterprise. So that is awesome. Everybody, everyone stayed on the line for the entire interview. It has been so cool. Shayne, I just want to say thank you to you before we do close it. Does anybody else have a desire to ask Shayne a question or type anything in the chat? Please don't lose out on this great opportunity where we have some time with Shayne. I'll pause here for a second. And we will make sure to get those links and resources out there. Oh, we did have a question on CPI, on inflation. Shayne, do you have an opinion on where that's going in the next year?
Yeah, so the answer is no, and the and the answer is that's the right answer, right? Because like if you're going to try to predict inflation, like you're crazy. So the kind of so how I would treat that. The question is, well, what do you do then? So the research has shown that the best approach in these sorts of ways is just to take last year's number and you use it next year. So we've actually conducted studies of this kind of thing to see, is this more accurate or is it not? And taking last year's value is often quite accurate. So, because if you try to guess up or you try to guess down, you're probably going to be wrong, right? And if you guess down and it goes up, like you're going to be way wrong. If you guess just, what was, take last year's number, pull it forward, you're kind of going to be a lot closer as opposed to trying to guess like, hyperinflation, deflation or that sort of thing. So it's for managing uncertainty, that is often a pretty good approach.
That's fantastic. My mind went back to the Gartner hype cycle and the inflation at the beginning, and what inflation we're talking about. Shayne, I think we will bring it to a conclusion, and hope everybody joins me in a virtual applause for Shayne Kavanagh and GFOA and the work that you're doing. Every year, you continue to push the boundaries of what our roles are, what skill sets we can build to be better finance professionals, and in general, just better public sector leaders in local government and in our communities. So thanks for the work of GFOA. Thanks especially for the work that you do, Shayne, to push that vision forward. And it's always relevant. I mean, to see your work right in the front lines with COVID recovery, with budgeting, with an equity lens, financial foundations, you are always evolving, and that's also exciting and rewarding to be a member of your community. So thanks for being a member of ours and joining us for today's call, Shayne.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you to everybody on this call, because to be quite honest, the stuff that we do at GFOA means absolutely nothing unless the folks who are working in cities and counties are finding it helpful, right? And if so, folks you guys are benefiting from it. We are very much gratitude to you all for doing what you do.
Wonderful. And we will follow up with some of the resources that Shayne has mentioned in a follow-up email. Please stay tuned if you like this kind of program. I think our next one happens, well, we have a session, our next Resource Exchange is in 2 weeks, where we go back north of the border, November 18th, for Ian McCormick in Strategic Steps and Kelly Rudick, his organization formerly of Strathcona County, talking about what's taking place in Canada. So that will be pretty cool. Shayne, thanks again. Hope that you find yourself in Denver again soon for some Hop Alley, and that is probably the nicest thing that I can say.
Right, and
my greatest wish for you.
Keep doing the takeout order and keep them alive, Chris. So
sounds good. That's the deal. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Shayne. We'll talk to you soon.
See y'all.